what's going on with housing, particularly in the wake of Australia's federal budget? And what, if anything, should the government do to make housing more affordable or to address intergenerational inequity between the generations? Well, with that in mind, I recently sat down at the Senate inquiry into intergenerational housing inequity, and here's what I had to say.
I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions, and Senator Bragg will lead us off.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank all of the inquiry for inviting me to come along. And the housing inquiry, I think, comes at a very timely juncture in our economy, in that it's important to look at what exactly is driving issues with housing prices and what exactly constitutes housing affordability. So let's focus on that second part. What is housing affordability? Because a lot of what I see in the media talks about the purchase price for a property. But one thing that really needs to be focused on is the life cycle of property ownership. From purchase price through to the actual ownership, through to the sale price. That is, we need to consider, is this person at least break even on their property throughout that life cycle of their ownership? Because if someone purchases a property and then ends up underwater in negative equity, that property has not been affordable. Much like if you go out and you buy a brand new vehicle, you end up losing a lot of money in depreciation, you end up owing the leasing company or the bank more than you paid for the car, that car was not affordable, unless you happen to have a lot of spare money to be able to throw at that vehicle. So I think that's the first point, focusing on what is affordability. But the second point is focusing on solutions to issues going on in the market. That is, what's going on with the number of houses, how to create more houses, and also what's going on with demand to some extent. And all of those things have different solutions and different policy tools. So for example, focusing on the supply side of it, how do we get more houses? Well, a lot of that comes down to what are the roadblocks to housing construction? Some of that involves some regulations. Some of the regulations could go by the wayside. Some are useful. Some of it also involves the sheer cost of building new houses. So one of the reasons off-the-plan developments are so expensive is because it is so expensive to build. And we see evidence of this through the thin margins the developers have and the sheer number of developers that have gone bankrupt, implying the developers can't skin more off their margin for them to remain viable and for construction to continue on. We've also got the issue in relation to demand for property. That is, are tax settings driving demand? And to my mind, we've seen some sentiment shift around the budget. However, if we think about, has the growth over the past couple of decades rather, been due to tax settings? A lot of it would really come down to the answer that no, it hasn't been. Because we can line up any house price growth graph with that of any other developed country, the United States, the United Kingdom, myriad other locations, and we see similar trends. And those locations didn't have the same capital gains tax changes Australia had quite some time ago. So just attributing house price growth to one thing like capital gains tax changes would of course be myopic. And that of course sets aside issues that we might touch upon, such as the downstream effects of capital gains tax changes, such as on stamp duty, transaction volume, which then feeds into state government budgets. Furthermore, we've got the issue of the role of the federal and state governments here. In particular, where the federal government can incentivize the states to develop property or develop housing or enable developments in ways that are more space efficient, such as, for example, enabling more terrace houses to create more density without forcing people necessarily into apartment blocks. So levers like that can help things move along. So in short, I think this is a very timely inquiry. I think it's important to dig really deeply into some of the changes that might be beneficial.
Thank you for that opening statement. Over to you, Senator Bragg.
Oh, thanks very much. So I guess the first thing I'll go to is the question of the tax changes. Do you think these tax changes will help the housing crisis or will they make it worse?
Well, I think, firstly, let's take for granted there is a crisis, because what exactly constitutes a crisis, I think we need to dig deeper into. But in terms of the tax changes, I don't see any way they're going to help. So let's unpackage that. Firstly, for example, my younger brother, but this is just anecdotal, but he's just one member of a cohort. He bought a property over the past 6 months. I can't see these tax changes benefiting him, because if he's ended up in negative equity, then now he ends up digging himself out of that negative equity. So there's a large cohort of people that bought over the past few years that are now incredibly worried about the impact of this on them. And you might be asking, well, okay, so this tax change is called a blip down in property. So is that now going to benefit the next cohort of first home buyers?
Yeah.
And for a very small number of people, it will benefit them. The people who buy during the blip down, they will benefit because they'll be buying while they're trying to catch a falling knife, assuming they catch that falling knife. However, that still doesn't address the underlying problem of demand continues to grow through population increases and supply is not growing. And when we get this decrease in property and in particular uncertainty surrounding things, you're going to get less development. And we can unpackage that. Firstly, you've got the uncertainty. That creates an increased opportunity cost of capital, which deters developers from actually developing. Because when they're thinking about, well, what are the policy changes going to be and are they going to go to an election? Well, that creates a lot of pause for developers. Secondly, developers aren't actually that profitable because just look at the number that have gone bankrupt. That tells you they're not actually making money hand over fist because otherwise you'd have more and more developers going forward developing more and more properties. That isn't really happening. So with these changes, the increased uncertainty, a blip down in prices, you're going to get less development. Now that does of course mean that prices are going to stabilize. So it's not as if prices are going to keep falling because when prices fall a bit, some developers will come in and they'll be like, okay, there's no other developers in the market. Let's try to make a bit of a profit developing when no one else is. So they will reach an equilibrium point. The big issue, of course, is this doesn't help supply over the long term. It doesn't encourage the developers to come in. And it also specifically, I think, and something that hasn't been talked about in the media nearly enough, is it deters mum and dad developers. So here I'm talking about people building granny flats. I'm talking about people renovating properties and then selling them. So for example, say you were to go and buy a dilapidated house, completely unlivable or very, very old. You go and renovate that and you sell it. That's a mum and dad developer play or a tradie developer play. That's the type of thing that ordinary Australians do quite frequently. But these new tax settings are going to dramatically increase the tax rate that that person would be paying. And ironically, they'd now be paying a higher tax rate, nearly 47% in effect, relative to the person that was just cruising on an apartment in inner city. So in Melbourne, the CBD apartments they've had anemic growth, sometimes negative growth. Similarly in Sydney CBD. So your tax rate now, ironically, is lower buying and holding an apartment than it is actually developing the apartment or actually developing the property. And that actually deters supply growth. So you've got a whole lot of unintended consequences. And then you've got the issue of, well, say we're wanting the government, normatively speaking, to get into the housing market in terms of affordable housing. Well, the money has to come from somewhere to do that. So if we're seeing stamp duty falling, well, how is a state government developing affordable housing when they're getting less stamp duty? Because they're now getting less tax revenue, but we're trying to get them to develop more. The two don't compute. And we're seeing early signs of this.
So effectively, your argument is that higher taxes will result in fewer houses.
Correct. I mean, there's no world in which a developer is going to build more when they're taxed more. There's no world in which the government can build more when the stamp duty has decreased. There's no world in which the government can build more when overall tax revenue has fallen. And I recently did a paper that shows that the tax revenue the government generates is actually going to decrease when you factor in all of the second order effects, lock-in effects, growth effects, fiscal spillovers like the stamp duty effect. When you factor in all of those, total government revenue could easily decrease on the back of increasing the capital gains tax rates.
Well, it seems to me that one behavioural response, and you'll know more about this than me, Associate Professor, is going to be in relation to people then over-capitalising on their own principal place residence because, of course, that is tax exempt. So is there a scenario where you see people investing more than they need to in their own place of residence now because of this very high and punitive tax on anything else in housing?
Yeah, so at the moment, your best investment in Australia is your principal place of residence. I mean, that's 0% tax, right? And I was having this conversation tangentially with startup investors recently. And you just look at it this way. The mortgage interest rate is about 6%, possibly higher depending on your characteristics. So let's go with 6% for a round number. For someone with the highest marginal tax rate, that's equivalent to a 12% return on another investment, which I'll note is above the ASX 200 in most years. But that is risk-free. So that's a 12% risk-free return.
Yeah.
So you then add an equity risk premium, that takes it up to 17% at least. So you add on another liquidity and additional risk premium for startups. You wouldn't invest in them, because why would you invest in that asset class when the opportunity cost of capital is simply much higher than the return you are likely to make? So putting in your principal place of residence makes sense. Now, of course, the question is that going to enable more people to get into their first home? And that's an interesting wrinkle, because theoretically, if you get all of the investors out of the market, then you will have more owner-occupiers. A property needs to sell from person A to person B.
Sure.
But if supply is not forthcoming,
Yeah.
you're not going to get more owner-occupiers because the supply isn't there and rents are going to go up, which makes it more difficult to save to buy your property. Because if your rent is high, then how are you saving to buy your deposit or your stamp duty? That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that the people who were investing a lot into the owner-occupied property, let's face it, I'm in finance, so for me, just piling all in on property wouldn't necessarily be the most obvious route for someone with my background. However, for mum and dad investors or mum and dad owner-occupiers, they don't necessarily have much familiarity with equity derivatives. They don't necessarily have much familiarity with the ETFs in the United States that they might want to invest in. There's a large number of people that don't have that background.
Yeah.
So they end up with money they want to deploy. Where do they deploy it? Well, to some extent deploying it in housing, but with lower returns. And that's what we often see.
Yeah, but ultimately, like, to go back to the fundamentals, the supply and the demand. So if you sort of zoom out, the supply is too low and it has collapsed over the last few years, and the migration has been high. So the combination of increased demand from migration and then lower supply of housing, I would have thought that those two factors would still be the principal drivers of the housing problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got large immigration. It varies a little bit about the characteristics of it, but at least quite large immigration, high numbers. And that's been consistent over time. So immigration is cumulative, right? In that it's not like you can just decrease it in 1 year and then your immigration goes down because you don't get a population decrease. You just get a slightly lower increase. So you've got increasing demand from population growth and supply is simply not keeping up. And there are several reasons for that. One, it is incredibly expensive to build. It's been estimated by various sources that up to half the cost of a build is government tax related. Then it's also incredibly slow to build. So you go to any apartment construction and you might go there this year if it starts, and then 3-4 years down the track, it will still be under construction.
Yeah.
So the time and cost makes it very difficult to get more supply.
So if you come back to this supply issue, is there any argument at all that can be justified to kick investors out? If ultimately you need more investment to build more housing, then can there be an argument? I mean, obviously the government have advanced an argument that they want to have fewer investors. I would have thought that right now what we want is as many investors as we can to get the supply up. So is there any good argument from a finance academic point of view that can be credibly advanced that there is the notion of bad investment?
In short, no, not in this context. And I'll use an analogy that I think is going to help to illustrate it. So say, for example, and the share-related analogy I think is the best way of putting this. Say you've got a startup that needs to raise capital, or a company that needs to raise capital. It needs to go out and sell shares to the market. It needs to get a reasonable price for those shares for it to be able to raise capital to keep investing. So that primary market then feeds into the secondary market, which is the price you can receive for those shares.
Yeah.
The same thing occurs with property. You need a well-functioning secondary market of existing development or existing supply for the primary market to get off the ground. So no developer is going to develop when their own buyers are deterred from investing. So for example, say a buyer of that new property is thinking, okay, I can maybe access negative gearing or the capital gains tax discount, but then their own seller, when they go to sell it, won't be able to. So they will
Yep.
obviously think about that second effect. You need to think
Yep.
about to whom you are selling the property. And developers will think about to whom they are selling, and that an original buyer will think about to whom they are selling down the track. And for many people, myself included, you start off renting and then owner occupy, which is where things like rent vesting come in. So you often do need investors to generate that initial supply, which can then feed into the owner occupied market. And when you get more supply and enable more supply, it enables rents to normalize, which enables people to save to buy property more, but it also creates more supply in the market, enabling more people to get into the property market.
So the contradiction here seems to me to be that the policy is that we don't want individual mum and dads or individual Australians to invest too much in housing, but we do want large wholesale funds to do that. That's the policy of the Labor government, where there's now a system of arbitrage, isn't there, where if you're a super fund, you'll only pay, I think it's 10% capital gains. A foreign fund manager investing through a managed investment trust would pay 15%, but then a person investing in the same underlying property would have to pay 30%. So, I mean, what's the justification from an academic point of view to say that there's some forms of investment that we do want if you're a big fish, but if you're a small fish, a small person, we don't want you? Can you explain this to me? I don't understand it.
Yeah, so basically, if I'm understanding correctly, you're effectively asking, is there any rationale for
Yes.
having a lower tax rate applicable to a super fund relative to an SMSF or relative to a mum and dad investor?
That's
And
right.
why is it that overseas investors could theoretically potentially get a lower capital and lower tax rate, although there are some wrinkles associated with foreign investors? And in reality, there isn't a lot of reason for treating the same investment done by an industry super fund as being different from that being done from SMSFs. So an SMSF, which is now unable to really borrow to purchase property, is going to now effectively be in a capital investing perspective in a worse position than a large industry super fund. And the reason for that is a large industry super fund
Yeah.
has access to capital from myriad sources. It's a big pot of assets. So it can go out and raise this capital. Whereas a small mum and dad SMSF, well, its only ability to borrow is really, unless there's some unusual circumstances, but basically only through the bank, only through those general structures that have now been banned. So the question is, should they be taxed higher than an industry super fund? I don't see any rationale for it. Particularly since those SMSF investors.
So the only reason to make that distinction is political.
It would look like I cannot point to another reason for that.
So there's no
And
academic or economic reason to penalise individuals, is there?
There's not relative to a big industry super fund or anything similar like that. There's no reason to penalise an individual or to level them with a higher rate than any other entity.
Okay. Well, look, just finally then, thanks for clarifying that. The government have said that these tax changes are about housing measures, but then they've hit everything with a 30% capital gains tax. So I'm just trying to make sense of that as well. I guess those are the two issues I've struggled to understand from an economic viewpoint. Why would you penalise individuals relative to institutions in terms of investing into housing and providing housing stock? You've explained that. And then the second one is, why does a so-called housing measure need to hit the whole economy with a 30% minimum CGT?
To be direct, if you were to really have these measures being about housing, you would have reduced CGT on shares and startups relative to that of housing. So if your real goal was to shift investment behavior entirely from housing into shares, what you would have done is slash CGT on shares and not kept it at this new higher level. And I'll use an illustration to make this clearer, or at least an analogy. Like I mentioned before, property price growth in Sydney CBD and Melbourne CBD, look at the apartments. Any real estate agent will tell you that forever they've been difficult to sell and price growth has been terrible in the middle of the CBD. It's ironically where one of the most affordable places to live is, right in the middle of the city. So that individual will probably face 0% capital gains tax under the new regime, because their price growth could easily be under inflation. By contrast, someone investing in shares will be facing an exponentially higher capital gains tax rate, particularly if they've done a good job. Someone renovating property is now going to face a much higher tax rate than someone who is just sitting passively on that property. It means that if the real goal were to stop passive sitting on property, this actually goes in the opposite direction, because that's actually the most tax advantaged. It's an interesting policy wrinkle that's come from it, I think.
Thank you, Associate Professor. You make a lot of sense. Next, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Bragg. I wanted to ask you, in your opening comments, you didn't, you covered a lot of ground, but you didn't mention the question of your perspective on intergenerational equity. And I'm just curious about how you see that. We've had a lot of evidence pointing to very significant changes in the rental regime that 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds face now. Longer periods of rent, higher rent relative to income, very low vacancy rates. And when we look at, for example, the Grattan Institute data on generational change in income growth, the generation born in 1990s, the first generation that at least we've got data for, where we see no improvement in income relative to the previous generation 30 years earlier. I just wonder what your perspective then is about housing, whether you're a homeowner or a renter, and intergenerational change.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things to maybe unpackage there. I guess almost tautologically, older people will own more than younger people. I mean, it's just the fact of being older, right? And you've had more years to accumulate things. So I don't per se see there as being an inequity to solve by virtue of, say, my father earning more than me.
No,
or
but
myself.
Sorry to interrupt you, but yes, you make that point in your words, but in your submission, as I recollect. But we're trying to compare like with like. The moment in a generation compared to the same moment for the generation earlier, and there seems to be, it seems to me, a lot of data pointing to a disadvantage if we're comparing like with like at the moment of their moment of intergenerational life.
I think it's very difficult to just compare like for like, because say, for example, we look at the baby boomers, they were often born in the wake of the disruption and chaos from World War II, right? So the older generation were built in a country that was often rebuilding its economy from an extremely harsh circumstance. So they might have gotten in at a good time, but also they suffered other disruptions. Furthermore, their life was different in different ways. So, for example, whereas many younger people can work from home, the older generation was not. So you end up with swings and roundabouts in terms of what one generation has benefited from, what one generation has not benefited from. So it's really difficult to compare the two. Focusing on some of the things you've mentioned, though, say we're looking at income growth. The issue in relation to income growth is real and it is genuine. And I think that many millennials feel as if they reach a career ceiling and are therefore unable to get ahead. And potentially costs are running ahead of what they're able to afford. That, however, is a slightly separate issue from per se what we do about housing or what we do about any other asset or what we do about any other price. So to point onto this, say your income is growing really slowly, but groceries are skyrocketing or petrol prices are skyrocketing or energy prices are skyrocketing. So the question is, does the government intervene in relation to all of those prices, or what is the actual policy solution? And in terms of solving income issues, the question is, how do we get around enabling people to get ahead so that they aren't continually feeling further and further behind? Some of that might come down to enabling better entrepreneurship. Some of it might come down to enabling side hustles. Some of it might come down to enabling people to just invest in crypto. Now, I don't invest in crypto, nor do I necessarily advocate it, but many people have and have made some money doing so to get ahead because they realize that their own personal income is growing anemically. And I think they're perhaps separate issues we need to address.
Well, last question then. What's your view? We've just heard this morning and we've heard from other witnesses about the rental market being very different, whether you're participating in commercial rental versus home rental, with commercial rental having longer lease periods, very conventionally, an inflation-related adjustment to your rent, and having more control over the use of your commercial rental property. What's your thought about what explains the differences and whether home rental arrangements should be adjusted?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting comment that I'd seen about that, and I think when we're analysing this, it's not per se that it's bad to necessarily have those commercial arrangements. It's just that we need to consider the totality of the commercial arrangement. So say we're looking at a commercial lease, the way they're typically structured is like a 3x3 or maybe a 2x2x2. So that is 2 years followed by 2 years followed by 2 years. So you break them down like that. And during that 2-year period or that 3-year period, which is set by contract between the individuals, it varies a lot. You'll get CPI-ish increases, maybe about 4%, give or take a bit. And then there'll be a rental review mid-lease or at that period. So after 2 years or whenever it is according to the lease terms. So that means that the rents aren't per se capped at CPI in commercial. Because what happens is they'll be at that capped rate, which is decided by contract. And that capped rate could be 10%, it could be 1%. It's just whatever they determine. Then there's a market rent review at the juncture normally, which means you'll get that rent review. In terms of and that creates a longer term lease as well. So you've got, it's not per se CPI, but also the leases are longer, which is one of the other points. Now, in some ways that's true, but that isn't necessarily because the tenant is the only one who wants a longer lease in that case. Often the landlord does. And the reason for that is in commercial leases, you get incredibly long vacancy rates. So say, for example, you had a convenience store that shuts down. It might be another 3, 4, 5, 6 months until you get another tenant. So you try to lock in the longer term because of those vacancy rates. Those vacancy rates also result in higher rent rates relative to residential. So the rental yield on commercial is typically higher than the rental yield on residential as well. Now, admittedly, part of that comes down to interest rates, but another part of it does come down to the dynamics of those leases as well. So if one is looking at transforming residential into commercial, we just need to consider what aspects are we changing. And if we're just changing the lease term, then you will end up with other unintended consequences over the long term. So say, for example, we require the lease terms to be at the option of the tenant 5 years. To use an example that I believe I kind of heard broadly speaking from the prior guest. So say it were 5 years, then you've got a landlord who is thinking, okay, do I want to lease it out for 5 years? And some of them will. Like some will be like, okay, I just want to forget about this, lease it out, be perfectly okay with that. And I think many landlords want to keep a good tenant for as long as humanly possible. I.e., if you've got a good tenant, you don't kick them out because, you could replace them with someone who will trash your place. So I can see why it could work. Potentially at the option of both parties, I think that you would need both parties to have a buy-in, because that person who might be renting it out now might be saving to be able to renovate it. Or there might be a rent investor who can't quite move into it right now, but they're intending to down the track. Or there's someone who is moving overseas for university, so a master's degree, or maybe they're moving overseas for a job, they intend to come back. So the 5-year term does create a lot of issues in terms of people who might be looking at moving into their own house. So it's something that would need to be thought about, I think, in a totality type approach, like a looking at it throughout the life cycle of the ownership and all of the aspects of typical commercial leases.
Well, thank you so much for your evidence this morning, Associate Professor. The committee's agreed that... Oh, sorry, Senator Brown. Forgive me, I didn't notice you had questions. Please ask your questions.
Yes, sorry, I'll be quick, Chair. I know we're running behind time. I
missed it.
How important is supply to being part of the housing fix?
Supply is definitely important in that, let's look at it this way. We've got relatively high immigration rates. I dare say that just personally, I'm much more pro-immigration than many people. You go ahead. You go ahead,
I
Senator
was
Brown.
I was just saying the immigration rates have come down when we look at the peak of
Correct.
in the 2020.
Oh, yes, for sure. So immigration rates have come down, but immigration is cumulative. So say, for example, immigration ran above
That's
supply
okay.
for 2
We
years.
go back to my original question. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, so the question is, how important is supply? Well, very important, because we've got people coming in and population is increasing, so you definitely need more supply. Otherwise, you're just not going to have enough houses.
Yep. So, in your work, have you had a look to see where investors are actually investing, whether they're established houses or are they building more supply?
So when we're looking at this, the established houses, I think, need to come in 2 categories, i.e. established houses that you just sit on and established houses that you renovate or improve, because that second category definitely improves the quality and quantity of supply. So someone who renovates an unlivable house, while that house technically existed, it now is effectively new supply. Someone who builds a granny flat or builds an attic conversion, that's additional supply. So I think we need to be really careful about just homogenizing all existing developments, because they're not the same. Many people will, both owner-occupiers and investors, buy existing developments if possible. And part of the reason for that is new developments are just so expensive. It's just so expensive to build that a new off-the-plan development typically is going to trade for much more than an existing house. So purely from an affordability perspective, most people will look at that existing property. However, you do get some people who prefer those off-the-plan ones. Either people who prefer something to take advantage of depreciation, which is greater in those new off-the-plan developments, or someone who doesn't want to deal with the issues that go wrong in an older property. So you definitely get those. You need those investors in the off-the-plan. Many of those investors are often coming from overseas or are PR here, and they prefer to buy off-the-plan as well. So you definitely get investors in those mixes as well. Most developers will tell you need the investors for those developments to actually be viable.
So, but you don't have any figures in terms of percentages?
In terms of percentages of what percentage of investor purchases are in new versus established, I don't have that percentage. I'd need to look that up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's fine. I'm not sure, but are you supportive of the initiatives the federal government put in place around that support increasing housing supply and infrastructure?
So I think it depends a little bit. Are you referring specifically to things like in the budget or broadly speaking?
Not just this last budget, in terms of, regardless of your position on the tax changes, but I'm talking about since the government's come in 2022, but the National Housing Accord, the Housing Australia Future Fund, the funds that have been put into environmental approval reform, simplifying building regulations, those sorts of changes.
Yes, so absolutely there have been some good things done. And indeed, I'm not per se opposed to some of the government's measures in relation to the 5% deposit scheme, in that I can understand why they have done that. So absolutely, this isn't to say that the federal government has been completely asleep at the wheel or that everything they have done is bad. I can see some benefits. So infrastructure development is vital in that you need electricity and plumbing and the like for you to be able to get new housing developments. Some of the other things that federal and state have done in terms of trying to make, I'm not sure whether the correct term is outer suburban areas, but outer suburban areas more livable, whether that's due to developments of city centres or airports and things, or also, and admittedly this is more state, but I know the federal gets a lot on board with this as well, developing public transport. So New South Wales Metro in Sydney is a game changer for housing supply coming online, because it now makes places like Rouse Hill significantly more attractive to be able to live in and develop than before. So absolutely there are benefits there.
So at the macro level, what changes need to take place over time to improve things?
Yes, so at the macro level, well, we've got several changes. If we were to look at things that would really help to move the needle, firstly, I think we need to have quicker approval processes, although I know some of that has been done, and a lot of it is at the local council level, which means that when we've got this separation of levels of government, it's a lot of us just point at the federal government and say it's your fault, but in reality, it might be a council thing. But if one can help to move the needle on councils, now, City of Sydney is the one I've had the most experience with. They've done quite well, but there are other councils that make things very difficult. Secondly, improving issues around density, by which I mean enabling more things like row houses or terrace houses that improve density without forcing people into apartments. And those can be enabled across the board, which, much like in Vietnam, helps to improve density, for example. A third thing would be, in reality, I don't think that the tax changes that have been brought in are going to be beneficial. I think there'll be a short blip down and then growth is going to resume as soon as the market adjusts. I think that's something that really needs to be thought about what is the revenue maximizing tax the government can impose. And I know that the budget had other issues, but the tax rate that's being imposed, I think, is not going to maximize federal government revenue. And if the goal is to maximize revenue, well, that is not going to achieve it through that higher capital gains tax regime. So those are the main things, reducing the cost and increasing the speed with which you can do housing construction, basically. And some of those are at the federal level.
Absolutely. I mean, the government's invested $2 billion in enabling infrastructure to unlock 65,000 new homes, but and also simplifying building regulations is an important issue. Do you have information around housing starts at all?
So new housing construction, I don't have specific numbers, but I also know that they have cooled. And that is in large part because we can see the trepidation in the market, and also because we can see what's happening with interest rates.
Would you be able to actually, on notice, provide some information around, because as we know, housing starts were up about 26% just last year. So it'd be nice to see. It's probably a little bit early, Professor, but we'll see what you can go back a couple, from 2022 or further, actually. Whatever you think's useful for our committee, that would be good.
Yeah, I can have a look at that. I know that I've looked, as an aside, I've looked at construction, but not in that type of figure that you're looking at. So as something that I'm sure will be available, in that I've done some needlessly technical, but what's called vector error correction modeling of house prices and population growth. So the two definitely go hand in hand. And part of that modeling involves construction. So construction data is available. Some of it from the ABS, but the level of granularity I'd need to check on.
Okay. Whatever you could supply, that would be good. Last question, Chair. I just, in your experience, what interest is there in the private equity market in investing in social and affordable housing projects?
All right, so it's an interesting field. So in the super funds, I've seen some interest. The main issue that arises with investors in those fields, and admittedly, this might be belying my family's background in medicine, but and you'll see the analogy in a second. If you lock yourself into what rent is the government going to set, you lock yourself into an extremely bad position. Much like if you're a doctor and you lock yourself into the Medicare rebate, you lock yourself into a losing position, which is why dentists have notoriously tried to resist being part of the Medicare regime. Similarly, with affordable housing, you end up with it being very unattractive because of the sheer risk you face in relation to government rents that are going to be paid. So I probably should have taken a back step. That's for rent-controlled affordable housing. For affordable housing, where you've got part of the development being affordable. So, for example, you're building 100 apartments, 5 of them are affordable, so to speak. Now, it isn't necessarily going to sink all property development deals. The problem that arises is that just increases the cost of the build implicitly. in that you're implicitly selling some apartments below market or below break even. And as a result, your costs effectively go up implicitly, which means a project that might have been viable, if those types of levies get too high, it becomes unviable. And then in the search of affordable housing, you get no housing. So I think it's important to consider those. In terms of private equity, I've seen relatively little interest, both in Australia and the United States. In what I've observed, because we don't have that much private equity building in Australia. In the United States, most of the PE is going to build to rent. And build to rent can be great, but it is expensive to rent it. So I'm not sure it's necessarily the panacea, because if you look at the build to rent developments in the US, they're typically renting above market. And they rent above market because it's turnkey and they do everything for you, which is nice, but they aren't necessarily affordable.
Well, thanks for that. But I was wondering, again, on notice, you said there's little interest. I was just wondering whether you could give me some more information or give the committee some more information around PE, the PE market, and what it looks like in Australia.
Yep.
Thanks, Professor. I enjoyed your evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown, and thank you, Associate Professor, for your evidence this morning. There are a couple of questions on notice. We thank you for that, and we invite you to give us any responses within 2 weeks of you receiving a copy of the Hansard transcript. But we appreciate your appearance today and your evidence this morning.
So you can see from my testimony that I don't think hiking capital gains tax rates is going to improve housing affordability. Affordability also needs to be considered across the life cycle of ownership, from purchase through to holding through to sale. And if you go into negative equity, that house that might have been cheap theoretically is no longer affordable. The government, if it is to do anything, needs to try to reduce its tax take on the construction of properties, and needs to potentially build more infrastructure to make properties more accessible. It needs to potentially get out of the way in terms of regulation. Now you'll notice an inherent issue here. I've talked about reducing capital gains tax rates, but also the government building more infrastructure. So what gives? Well, firstly, hiking capital gains tax rates does not necessarily raise more revenue, as I have personally modelled, because once you consider the second order effects of hiking rates, so the lock-in effect, lower fiscal spillovers and things like stamp duty, lower growth, the issue that people might move their money to a lower taxed alternative or overseas, when you factor in all of those things, a high capital gains tax rate does not necessarily result in a higher government revenue. Meaning that if you want to spend the government money on things like infrastructure, that money needs to come from somewhere, and if you're hiking rates and therefore reducing government revenue, you have reduced your ability to actually go out and invest in those things, which I think is a massive problem. So we need to consider this in a nuanced way, rather than just saying hiking rates kills investors. So rather than just saying hiking rates is bad for investors, therefore good for everyone else, you have to ask yourself, what happens to government revenue? What happens to new construction? If you don't get new construction when you've got more people coming in, well, how do the two compute? How do the two square? How do you get housing being more affordable when people aren't willing to go out and invest in housing at a price that makes sense? And prices can't materially decrease too much, because otherwise developers simply won't make any money, so you don't get any more supply. So all of these things need to be considered in a nuanced and whole of package type way, rather than just trying to point to one thing. One thing I do, however, want to leave this on is oftentimes capital gains tax and investors are blamed for housing getting more expensive. But you can see housing graphs across the world. Housing has gotten more expensive everywhere. And this means that it isn't just Australia's changing capital gains tax rates that causes house price changes. Rather, there must be something else going on. Broader population growth, broader trends in terms of what people want to do in terms of living in cities, and all of those types of things that might be feeding into what's going on with house prices, rather than just pointing toward, oh, capital gains taxes were made lower, therefore it's the evil investors' fault. Clearly, that is not the case. Still, you can let me know your thoughts about what's going on in property in the comments below. And of course, thanks for tuning in, and hopefully I see you next time as well.